This is Ty Bricker coming to you from beautiful Colorado. We're gonna do a little history exploration today. We're gonna discuss kind of the tribal history lineage of Israel, Palestine, that general area, and try to. We're gonna deep dive habitation in that area, state sponsored and tribal, and just try to come up with a different approach here on just the viability of that region and whether or not historic lineage to land means anything, and if it does mean anything, what exactly it does mean. And so we're gonna go over a few different factors. We're gonna explore. We're gonna Americanize the issue a little bit so it's better understood from our eyes, which we gotta be honest. As Americans, we're not exactly the most well-rounded, globally historic, geopolitical people on the planet. That's for sure. And so we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about Israel. And don't worry, Douglas Murray. I've been to Israel, been there. So I'm going to talk about it. All right. So here we go. Let's just go for it. And Adam Jensen, since you're probably the only individual actually watching this damn thing, I appreciate you, buddy. Love you. All right. Israel v. Palestine. For 3,000 years, this area of the world has been fought over, bled over, debated, religiously claimed, highly contested, and filled with both animosity and reverence. There are two distinct sides of this dispute. One side believes that they were chosen by God via scripture, that the land was chosen for them, and that the re-inhabitation of this land must happen or be accomplished or continued at any cost. They have the backing of powerful states, a dominant military, and theoretically all of the Christian and Jewish world behind them. When I say powerful states, obviously I'm primarily referring to the United States. The other side has continually inhabited the land both before and after it was fragmented by the Roman Empire in 70 AD. They were not the conquerors nor the enslavers of the Jewish people, but tribal peoples that built their lives, traditions, and family groups in that tumultuous land that would eventually be known as Palestine and Israel, both before and after. Sorry, this is super necessary. Try not to make any weird sipping sounds or anything. Though the Palestinian people only became known to the world in the 7th century AD officially, so the 600s, they tribally inhabited the land for unknown millennia before that. And much like how the Prussians became German, the Celts Irish, the Aztec and Mayans Mexican, Germanic tribes European, and the Native Americans American, eventually the tribal Arabs of that region became Palestinians. And from 70 AD to 1948, exactly 1,878 years and 1,631 years longer than the United States has existed, they inhabited and populated the land that was once Israel. The question of who's right and who's wrong is too simple, as the animosity perpetrated by both sides eclipses understanding and reason. Much has been written on the topic. Much more will be written on the topic. We're just going to investigate the origins of the conflict from the sides and tribal habitation of the land itself. Most individuals with a limited understanding of the conflict will generally point to religion as being the primary offender of the conflict. The Hebrews, Israelis, Israelites, or sons and daughters of Israel, any of these names will suffice, as each of these names are historically accurate depictors, are Jews or Jewish individuals, one whose religion is Judaism. The origins of the Jewish people stem from biblical prophecy within the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. The term Jew in Hebrew is Yehudi, which is Yehudi, referring to the people of either the kingdom of Judea or the tribe of Judea, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jewish people in the Hebrew Bible are also called Hebrews. Okay, via the Old Testament, the ancient Israelites believed that they were descended from 3 individuals. All right, Abraham's son Isaac, and Jacob, who was later renamed Israel by God. Jerusalem, as a city-state, is believed to have been founded as a settlement around 3,500 to 3,000 BC, as a tribal settlement. It was not a theocratic empire based on religion at that point. It was just a simple little city-state. And, we're talking about 5,000 plus years ago. In 1000 BC, so at least 2,000 years after Israel had been established as a city, King David conquered Jerusalem. I'm sorry, not Israel as a city, but Jerusalem as a city. King David conquered Jerusalem, making it the center or capital of the Jewish kingdom, erecting the original temple some 40 years later. All right, so in 586 BC, the Babylonians took the city, destroyed the original temple, and sent the Jewish people into exile. All right, and that's biblically accurate. In 530 BC, Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire and mentioned in the Old Testament around 30 times, a very, very prominent and historic figure, permitted the Jewish people to re-inhabit Jerusalem again and rebuild their temple. However, again, Alexander the Great conquered Jerusalem in 332 BC, and over the next several hundred years, the city was conquered and governed by different societies such as the Romans, Persians, Arabs, Fatimids, Turks, Crusaders, Egyptians, Mamelukes, and Islamists. I mean, that's at least 9 different conquering entities right there just of the city of Jerusalem. For context, it is important to understand the origins as the Jewish people see it, as the Israelites see it, through the lens of the Hebrew Bible, okay? Because the Old Testament exclusively, as there are currently no other historical or archaeological records of the ancient Israelites outside of the Old Testament. We will get into that a little bit more through the Egyptian lens and some other stuff, but we're not quite there yet. Details their story, or more specifically, the book of Exodus, okay? This book covers a period of approximately 80 years, from shortly before Moses' birth, which is believed to be around 1520-ish BC, to the events that occurred on Mount Sinai almost 70 years later, around 1440 BC. Okay? The story of Israelite slavery, Genesis details a slavery period lasting 400 years, whereas Exodus details 430 years of slavery. I mean, when you're talking about 4 centuries, 30 years, give or take, isn't too bad for those 2 books to have them, one saying 400 and one saying 430. At the hands of the Egyptian Empire, all right, can be found within the first 18 chapters of Exodus. However, Exodus provides us with 2 accounts of the exiting Jews. The first one, Exodus chapter 4, verse 15. And it was told to the king of Egypt that the people had fled. Now remember that part, because remember Moses is informed by Yahweh or Elohim, depending on which of the books you're kind of looking at. This is another thing worth referencing here. Within the Old Testament, especially Exodus and Genesis, there's really 4 different books that kind of make up those stories in the Bible. They date back to around 2000 BC all the way up to like around 1000 BC. 2 of the books describe Yahweh as being kind of a monotheistic God, no other God besides me. There's no other gods, period. But in the other 2 books, they don't detail Yahweh. They detail El or Elohim, or El and then another word. And so based on those 2 books, it's more similar. The god structure is more similar to how the Greeks viewed gods, with Zeus on the top of the pantheon and then other gods underneath. So in the other 2, it's interesting because in the other 2 Old Testament books, Elohim or El, he's actually a god of gods and realms. Okay, and so it's important to kind of understand that just as an individual human being. And so anyway, besides the point. First Exodus chapter 14, verse 5, and it was told to the king of Egypt that the people had fled. There's a big difference between fled and what we're about ready to say. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 39, it says, because they were driven out of Egypt. Being driven out and having the people flee are 2 completely different things, right? One is intentional and overt, and the other one's non-intentional because you're not planning on being driven out. You want to stay. One account states that they had fled on their own, whereas the other account details them as being driven out of Egypt. Okay, so let's look at that a little bit more. All right, so the distinction may be historically significant. One thing we have to realize here is the Egyptian Empire kept meticulous records. They were really, really good at record keeping. And so it's kind of unusual, it would seem, that they would have a very specific set of individuals based on from a real specific genetic heritage, like the sons and daughter of Israel, Israelites, Israelis, Hebrews, whatever they wanted to call, whatever they were calling themselves, and have the fact that the Egyptians have no record for them at all, and they don't. The Egyptians don't have any records at all for 400 years, 430 years of enslaved Hebrew people or Israelite people or the sons and daughters of Israel people. However, within the text Manetho, which is an Egyptian text, does detail a people, possibly the Israelites, whose timeline somewhat matches up with the Old Testament timeline, named the Hyksos, okay, where they came from Canaan. Okay, so this is what it says in the Egyptian book Manetho. All right, Hyksos, who came from Canaan, overran Egypt and were driven out, went back to Canaan, and ultimately settled in Jerusalem. Were the Hyksos the original Israelites? If so, it would seem that they were not slaves, based on this narrative, but invaders that were driven out of Egypt by the Egyptian military, as stated in Exodus, in the Old Testament chapter Exodus, chapter 12, verse 39. If this record is correct, it could possibly overturn the Jewish narrative of Egyptian enslavement. There's a big difference between fleeing and being driven out, as well as anything stemming from that belief. Obviously, we don't know if the Hyksos are the Israelis. Maybe, maybe not. It's really hard to say. But that's the closest thing we know based on Egyptian documentation and records that could possibly be the Israelites or the sons and daughters of Israel. Got to happen again. So good. Once it touches the lips, it's so good. All right, this belief structure is foundational to the Jewish faith. The children of Israel were enslaved in a foreign land, delivered to freedom miraculously by God and Moses, or Yahweh or El, or Elohim, depending which book, wandered the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan for 40 years, right? Settled at Mount Sinai where Moses would receive the covenant, the 10 commandments, the idea of Israel as a theocratic state, the 10 plagues, the Passover, the parting of the Red Sea, and God or El or Elohim's menacing presence on Mount Sinai. Okay, in 10,000 BC, we'll say this again, King David conquers Jerusalem, making it the Jewish capital. In 586 BC, the Babylonians take the city, destroy the temple, cast them out. Cyrus the Great cedes the Israeli state of Jerusalem back to the Jews in 530 BC, where it was again lost via conquest to Alexander the Great in 332 BC. And then in 63 BC, Roman Pompey the Great reconquers Jerusalem, swallowing up the region into the Roman Empire. And then in 70 CE, the Romans annihilated a Jewish uprising, destroying the temple and burning down most of the city of Jerusalem. Legendary Jewish historian and writer Josephus, who you may or may not have heard of, he lived right around 37 AD, so he was born a couple years after Jesus would have been crucified, to 100 AD. And he wrote that over 1 million people perished during this siege. And after the cause was lost, 97,000 more Israelites were enslaved into the Roman Empire. So 1 million died, 97,000-ish enslaved. This marked the end of the Jewish state, Israel, until 1948. Okay, so from 70 AD until 1948, 1,878 years vanquished. Okay. The story of the Arab Palestinians within the Israeli-Palestinian region date much further back than the Israelis, Israelites, Hebrews, or the sons of daughter of Israel. As far as we know, the earliest record of Israelite history stems from the Old Testament. As we said, there's no other archaeological record of the Israelites, sons and daughters of Israel, Hebrews, outside of Old Testament, depicting Moses and the Jewish enslavement by the Egyptians around 1500-ish BC. However, tribal inhabitation of Israel or Palestine region, or Canaan land, as it was known by the ancients. And you'll see in a lot of those ancient texts, they talk about Canaan land, right? Or the land of Canaan, or Canaan. Can be dated as far back as 17,000 BC, at least, when humanity began shifting from gathering to production. For example, Göbekli Tepe, a profound Neolithic agricultural site in southeastern Anatolia region of Turkey, dates back to 10,000 BC. Okay, and let's look at that one really quick, because Göbekli Tepe is super cool. It could very well be the world's first temple, complete with outrageously heavy and tall megaliths depicting the equinoxes, constellations, various species of animals, and extinct languages, predating Stonehenge by at least 6,000 years. Göbekli Tepe also predates agriculture within the Fertile Crescent region. To date, only 5% has been excavated so far, which means that there's still a hell of a lot about that specific site to discover and understand. Okay, so Göbekli Tepe is pretty darn cool. From 8,000 to 4,000 BC, so a 4,000-year time frame, tribal peoples of this region began breeding animals and cultivating grains. Trade was also being developed throughout the region. Ancient Sumer originated around 5,000 BC in modern Iraq, in the lands the Greeks called Mesopotamia, which was the land between the rivers, which was the Tigris and the Euphrates. So Mesopotamia is actually a Greek term, in case you don't know, for the land between the rivers. Predominantly known as the world's first organized civilization, Sumer, the biblical Abraham, for example, was originally located in Ur, which was a city of Sumer, all right, which is kind of a cool subtopic. He was then commanded by God to leave and migrate to Canaan land, all right, like we just talked about. Sumer, or Mesopotamia, is also where the Jews were exiled after the Babylonians first conquered Jerusalem, Exodus in the Old Testament. From 4,000 to 2,000 BC, dramatic economic, social, and archaeological changes took place within Palestine. The most notable archaeological development was the appearance of a large number of cemeteries where engravings can be found on the outside and inside of rocks and rock structures within that region. The use of metals, the emergence of temples, and an increased standard of living. From 2000 BC to 1200 BC, political relationships and commerce began to form. Now remember, 2000 BC is about when the oldest Old Testament book is supposed to be dated. Okay, so that's this time frame here. Political relationships and commerce began to form. This happened almost notably within the eastern regions, distinctly Egypt, Bilad al-Shahim, north of Syria, and east of Turkey. Documented history for this time frame details the reign of the 18th dynasty and the expulsion of the Hyksos, or Hyksos, possibly the Israelites, right? Like we just talked about, and with the Egyptian documentation, the one group of people who could possibly be the Israelites, which were the Hyksos, be Egyptian language, is the closest, like we said, the closest group of people that could match up to that time and location of the Israelites. But again, we don't know that. We definitely don't know it for sure. Okay. From 1200 to 550 BC, cities like Gaza, we know it now as the Gaza Strip, and others saw their formation. The Palestinians were considered as the legitimate successors of Egyptian authority. And at that time, in the Canaanites, actually, you know what? We don't even need to really go into that part of it. All right. Comparatively speaking, when one investigates the totality of evidence regarding the origins of both cultures, we're talking the Palestinian origin and the Israelite origin, in combination with the regional histories, one must come up with the conclusion that there is more archaeological evidence and written history detailing Arab Palestinian habitation, for sure. Now remember, Arab isn't the same as Muslim, okay? The Muslims didn't, the term Islam and Muslim didn't exist until the first millennia, like halfway through the first millennia AD. And so we're just talking about Arab Palestinian habitation. As far as biblical history is concerned, the biblical history details the founding of Judaism and Christianity. One should expect that the document incorporates more history and lineage for the Israelites, obviously, than the Arabs or the Palestinians. After all, The Quran details the adventures of Allah and Muhammad. The Hebrew Bible details the adventures of Yahweh or El or Elohim and Moses, among others. Those of us living in first world democratic societies, especially within the United States, should understand that our political origins stemming from the ideals of Christianity, Judaism, and Old Testament Zionism. That's where our ideals stem from in this country. The Puritan Pilgrims believed themselves to be the founders of a new Israeli state here in America. It's actually referenced in a lot of those old works with the Puritans and the Pilgrims, where they could abandon the iron grip of the Church of England for Puritan religious freedom as Protestants, right, in the Americas. Okay? Yeah, we'll take a look at this. The Old Testament was a significant intellectual sphere through which pre-Civil War Americans articulated and constructed their political and national consciousness. The Puritans found the political history of the ancient Israelites as a model for republicanism. Protestants emphasized and incorporated the political readings of the Old Testament into their colonial political theology. Without question, Old Testament principles were investigated and used by the Puritans far more than New Testament principles, for sure. So we'll kind of get into what that looks like a little bit. An additional reason for the significance and historical understanding of taught history within Christian societies is as follows. Until Thomas Jefferson performed the first known archaeological field excavation of an ancient earthwork that was on his property, where he correctly and for the first time documented sediment layering and age. In other words, the deeper you go, the older it gets, right? And the more surface level you are, the younger it gets when it comes to archaeological discovery. The majority of history was taught through the Bible and primarily through the Old Testament. Historic Christians determined the age of the earth through Scripture, how the earth was formed through Scripture, how long it took through Scripture, how man evolved out of the Garden of Eden through Scripture, the Great Flood, originally it's talked about all over the world. The Great Flood's really interesting. North America, South America, the Nordic countries, the Germanic countries, Mesopotamian countries. The Great Flood it seems to be a mythological memory. It's not myth. It's turned into mythology. But it seems like a really deeply ingrained human memory that's been passed down for a long, long, long time, along with some other traditions and beliefs. But the global flood's a super interesting thing to dive into. For millennia after the death of Jesus Christ, this is how history was taught and understood. Converted Christians throughout the New World understood history through the stories of the Old Testament. Honestly, they weren't even permitted under direct threat of the church to address previously believed ancient mythological or spiritual pagan beliefs, right? Because, they were burning people up for that stuff. Like, how dare you think independently or say that the earth is not the center of the universe and everything revolves around us? How many scientists and teachers were overtly burned up to death for daring to have any kind of reasonable belief independent of being told what to think? Throughout the 19th century, Christian Zionists like Louis Way, Joseph Wolf, William Blackstone, and Edward Irving, who all espoused deep beliefs in literal biblical interpretation, sent Bibles to prominent politicians in which every single reference to Israel or Zion was highlighted and underlined. Okay? The intent was to urge them to insist Zionists settle only in Palestine. In 1990, Robert Stearns, an evangelical Christian pastor from upstate New York, said the following. And this is in 1990. A growing group of us is prepared to lay down our lives for Israel and the Jewish people. Stephen Spector, author of Evangelicals in Israel, The Story of American Christian Zionism, points out that many Jewish individuals, as he is, do not understand the deep convictions and empathy that Christian Zionists display towards the state of Israel, especially since the Jewish people do not have the same convictions towards Christianity, arguably believing that the true intent of Christians is to convert Jewish people to Christianity. This is pretty interesting because I listened to Ben Shapiro talk about Jesus and how the Israelis or the Jewish people believed. Obviously, it's a completely different religious structure, but you have to understand that to the Jewish people, Jesus was just a guy. Like, there was nothing special about him at all. They're still celebrating Passover, because they don't believe that who Jesus represented was actually him. And so, they're celebrating Passover right now, and it's 3,500 plus years, just because they still don't believe that what was supposed to happen happened, where Christians obviously do believe that. All right, whatever the case, the counter argument is simple and fundamentalist Christianity, both past and present, using the Old Testament as their dominant source of history. After all, how can Revelations be entirely accurate if Genesis is not, right? I mean, you're talking Old Testament, New Testament, but it's got to combine, it's got to work, it's got to complement each other. The New Testament is linked to the Old, as Jesus, who certainly created Christianity, would have only known and understood Old Testament prophecy, history, and lineage through the Hebrew Bible. In turn, the Christian Bible incorporates both Old Testament and New Testament, whereas the totality of the Hebrew Bible is Old Testament. I feel like we've kind of beaten this horse to death. It makes sense. All right. Coffee. Okay. Our knowledge of history and historic events, combined with our ongoing understanding of ancient mythology, are continually expanding. The growing developments within science, such as archaeology, genealogy, maritime archaeology is super cool. Why? Because during the Ice Age, sea levels were around 500 feet lower than they are today, which means the oceanfront property then is deep underwater today. Most people, human beings, have a tendency to gravitate towards water because water is life, whether you're talking about the oceans or you're talking about the Rhine, the Euphrates, the Amazon, or the Mississippi, right? So maritime archaeology is getting really cool. And obviously sea levels after the Younger Dryas event from around 11,000 years ago, almost overnight, rose 500 feet, which I think is where we get a lot of those global flood stories. Linguistic translation is another interesting one. Historical linguistics, the historic study of language. Historical scholars, etc., have sped up discovery and understanding to an unprecedented level. For the first time in human history, we can now combine archaeology, history, and mythology for a more complete understanding of significant events and timelines. It's super cool, man, to be able to incorporate mythology. I think we're just starting to figure out, like within the last 5 years, 10 years, thanks to certain individuals, that mythology is super important. I mean, it's so incredibly, amazingly important, and it's super cool. It's really awesome that we're combining all these elements for outcomes. It's pretty cool. While explaining the case for Israel, some historians or political scientists point to the premise that peoples have a right to self-determination in their own land, right? Saying that the state of Israel is the own land to the Hebrews. As stated by Ruth Galvin in her essay, The Jews, Right to Statehood, a Defense. Or, as Raymond Schneiderlin put it in his book, A Short History of Jewish People from Legendary Times to Modern Statehood, that the legacy of the Israelites dates back to at least the reign of King David in 1000 BC. To counter this, it's time to better understand what ancient history truly means, especially if a group of individuals, humans, a society, a collective, is going to make land claims based on historic lineage. Okay. We're going to attempt to Americanize this again a little bit. Arabian history is not our history, it's an American history. As the Christian world grew through Rome, Europe, the British Isles, and into the Americas, societies and indigenous peoples were taught about the origins of man through the Old Testament God. Like we said, Scripture became history, and the history and plight of the ancient Israelites became the history and plight of all Christians in all regions, even though Christians aren't Jewish people, right? Because of this, the archaeological history of the Middle East is lost on most Americans, which details a history far outside the bounds of the Bible. Even though the Bible plays an important role in history, it has extremely accurate documents and events and locations and peoples. I mean, we just found, it seems like the city of Sodom has been found in southern Turkey, which was probably blown up through an airburst around 2000 BC. You have Cyrus the Great. You have the Great Deluge. There's a lot of interesting things in the Bible that ancient battles and peoples and civilizations that are pretty accurate. So we can't discount that. For a better understanding, let us compare the plight of the Native Americans to that of the ancient Israelites, okay? As the plight of the Native Americans is far better understood by Americans than the plight of the Palestinians. And when I say that we're going to compare the Native Americans to the Israelites, we're talking about historic land habitation, all right? And we can't identify with the Palestinians, but we can identify with the Native Americans. The documented history of the Israelites has been previously revealed, all right, with the calculation of total inhabitation being around 822 years. I know you're not going to like that, but let's do the math here for a minute. Okay, Jerusalem is a city-state before it was a theocratic state based on religion. King David, 1000 BC to 586 BC, a little over 400 years. Cyrus the Great, when he gave them back from the Persian Empire, 530 BC to 332 BC. Roman occupation, 530 BC to 70 AD. United Nations after World War II, 1948 to present. Okay, 1000 BC to 586, 530 to 332, 56 BC to 70 AD, 1948 to present. For transparency, when one Googles how long the Jewish people have lived in the Holy Land, the most common answer is 4,000 years. Going 1,000 years further back than King David even. All right, so the reality is that the documented history of the Israeli state as a state or Jerusalem as a city-state combines to roughly 822 years, give or take. You can't say that the Israeli people or the Hebrews were inhabiting that land from 70 AD after the Romans kicked them out and enslaved everybody and killed 1 million of them to 1948. That's, like I said, 1,800 years where they obviously did not have a state, and they and no Jewish people really at that time lived in that area. They were all over Europe, the Americas. They weren't a nation state. They were a religion, much like how Christianity is now, right? You have people that are Christians in Africa and Europe and in the Americas. It was the same way with the Jewish people. All right, but they did not live in Jerusalem, and they did not live in Israel. Okay. Outside of that, we were really discussing and debating tribalism and tribal inhabitation outside of institutionalism, like I said. Secondarily, we must also remember the vast majority of this inhabitation, almost 100% of it, is exclusively documented in the Old Testament and outside of the current archaeological record. So what we're going to do is we're going to give the Jewish people all 4,000 years. We're going to give them all 4,000 years, even though, based on my calculations, it's 822 years. I'm sure there's plenty of people who will be super pissed off about that, whatever. But we'll give you the whole 4,000 years. All right, so let's see what that ends up. What does that mean? The documented history of the ancient Native Americans within the Americas has become fantastic. Indisputable evidence attributes human existence within the Americas back an incredible 23,000 years before present at least. So at least, 21,000 years BC. Furthermore, some archaeologists and historians even believe that the dates of American inhabitation can be traced back to an astonishing 100,000 years before present or more. There's a large split in the historical and archaeological community here, but things are really starting to lean towards being way, way, way older. It's starting to happen, and it's happening fast. There are vast records of Native American inhabitation, vast records from the Spanish conquistadors. Their Christian missionaries explored both the Amazon jungles and the Amazon River and the Rocky Mountains. To the Pilgrim Puritans of New England, Native American lineage within the Americas is unquestionable. It dates back much further than the 4,000-year Google history of the ancient Israelites. For another reference, and we'll talk about this again, in White Sands National Park, New Mexico, fossilized footprints go back 23,000 years. I mean, that's indisputable evidence that there were tribal people inhabiting this area for tens of thousands of years before the United States became the United States. For historians, political scientists, and politicians that attribute and guarantee Israeli statehood because of historic presence in the area, should the same standard not exist for the Native Americans? Why not? All right. Interestingly, when American Christians are pressed with this comparison, the answer I get back is generally twofold. All right. One, the Native Americans are not mentioned in the Bible, therefore their rights to land ownership are void. Okay. 2, the Native Americans did nothing with the land when they owned it, therefore it is better used today through industry and agriculture. When pressed, it usually comes back to one of those two things. That's what I have found. There can be a lot of talk, but it kind of veers back to one of those two things. If they're going to believe that the Native Americans don't deserve to have any kind of land back that they want. However, almost every peer-reviewed article, book, or news source that incorporates primitive ancient inhabitation as a justification for the reemergence of the Israeli state simply details historic inhabitation or divine request based on scripture for justification. Based on the historical lineage argument, the same argument used for Israel, the entirety of the Americas should be turned back over to the Native American tribes, as it was done for Israel by the UN in 1948. We're talking about, we'll give you the whole 4,000 years, and we got at least 23,000 years of habitation of the Native Americans. All right. Regarding the divine argument, there is none to make. For when the divine is introduced, we are now dealing with mythology and individual spiritualism. Christians and Christian denominations can't even agree on fundamental Christian beliefs, honestly. The same can be said for sects of Judaism and Islam. They can't even agree to what their basic belief structure is. Those that believe that the Holy Land belongs to the Israelites via scripture are not going to be curtailed in those beliefs through archaeological or historical discovery. They're just not. Our postmodern and highly educated society now understands and sympathizes with the atrocities the Native Americans faced. When pressed, the average American believes they got a raw deal. However, the plight of the Palestinians is not known by Americans, as most Americans view Palestinians as Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, terrorists, jihadists, extremists, murderers, or land thieves for stealing the Israeli state, even though they had nothing to do with the Romans kicking the Hebrews out of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Palestinians didn't have anything to do with that, believe it or not. These beliefs are incorrect. The vast majority of Palestinian people are simply human beings trying to live some kind of a life while raising a family in a war-torn, severely war-torn, horribly ravaged country. A country that gives them no rights, no property, no representation, little to no industry, and damn sure no protection under the law. Okay? Let us now investigate the Zionist movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Coffee. All right. The first prominent Zionist conference we know of took place in Switzerland in 1897. The Ottoman Empire, which still existed at that time, pre-World War I, understood that the Zionists wanted to relocate Jewish people to the Palestinian region. And this conference started the process. At this time, also, the reason this started is because of the following. Throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, pogroms are organized massacres of Jewish peoples, had been taking place. The brutality of these pogroms is legendary and still discussed within the Jewish community today, and should be. Educated Zionist leaders understood that the situation was getting worse, especially in Eastern Europe. John Clyer's book, Russians, Jews, and the Pogroms of 1881-1882, excellently details the extent of some of the horrendous atrocities that were executed against the Jewish people. Now remember, First Zionist Conference, 1887, right? These pogroms took place about 5 years before that. So they already kind of saw the writing on the wall, right? The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 was on the horizon as well, and the Russian people were suffering greatly. Food shortages, government corruption, economic hardship was about to bring this giant empire to its knees, and the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II, as well as his entire family, was squarely on the horizon. Interestingly, it was Jewish revolutionaries who assassinated him and his family, just as a side note. The economic hardship faced by the citizenry was placed squarely at the feet of the Jewish people. Eastern European Christians were directly responsible for this, and they blamed the greedy Jews for taking their money, land, power, and influence. Since the pogroms began in Russia, Poland, and other regions, thousands of men, women, and children had been brutally murdered in some of the most monstrous ways possible. Men were made to watch the violent, repeated raping of their wives and daughters before being slowly dismembered themselves. Their sons were butchered and burned alive, all their possessions confiscated. During this time and throughout the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish peoples of various nationalities and languages started immigrating to Palestine, all right, after the Zionist Conference of 1897 in Switzerland. Leaders of the Zionist movement were desperate to relocate their people as the pogroms raged and spread. Regular Jewish people were at a crossroads. Should they migrate to an unknown land in the desert that they don't know anything about and don't speak any of the language? Because remember, even though they're Jewish, they don't know anything about Israel or Palestine. They haven't been there for almost 2,000 years. Or should they stay where their families have lived for hundreds or maybe thousands of years, as they said? Things were sure to get better, right? Wrong. I mean, the unknown ending of this disaster was the Holocaust, and they didn't know it at that time because we're still talking about the end of the 19th century. The Zionists started to become militant. And honestly, who could blame them, really? The pogroms raged for years, spreading from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. Even the enlightened first world states, such as the United States, Great Britain, France, and others, were using overt anti-Jewish rhetoric. For example, American anti-Semitism post-World War I inspired quotas restricting Jewish students from attending institutions of higher learning despite their qualifications, and also led to the exclusion from certain universities, neighborhoods, hotels, and clubs. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other institutions of higher learning limited the enrollment of Jews to discourage the rise of anti-Semitism, which was seriously taking place. Prominent figures also came forward. Henry Ford, for example, started the Ford Motor Company, was really known for his anti-Semitism. Published a paper in 1920s in Michigan, Dearborn, believed that the Jewish people sought to control the world by commerce and exchange. His beliefs were praised in Hitler's Mein Kampf. In Mein Kampf, Hitler praises Henry Ford. Another interesting side note to history. While the Zionists relocated Jews to Palestine at a record pace, the Ottoman Empire became concerned, as did the Palestinian people. They didn't mind bringing in the Jews. They even overtly welcomed it, believe it or not, which brings us to another misconception that I mentioned at the beginning of this. Outside of tribal warfare, the Jewish people and the Palestinian, now predominantly Muslim, obviously, had little to no animosity towards one another, almost nothing. There was no animosity. There was far more animosity between the Muslims and Christians because of the Crusades, and against the Muslim against Muslim because of the Sunni versus Shia split. Which, if you think, you can Christianize that too, when you can say the Protestants versus the Catholics, right? Because the Protestants and the Catholics killed the shit out of each other in Ireland, so it's not like they're any better than the Sunni and the Shia for that. The Jewish people, or the Israelites, had not lived within Palestine for almost 2,000 years at that time, and the Palestinians had nothing, like I said, zero to do with the Israeli state falling to the Roman Empire in 70 AD. Nothing to do with that. Nor were they Muslims at that time, nor were the Arabs was there any kind of religious tension between the Arabs and the Jewish people. However, the Jewish people were coming into Palestine at a record pace at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, with no end in sight. Okay, think about it like this. We're gonna Americanize this again. So it's just like how we could Americanize the Palestinian plight and the Native American plight and the time frame of habitation. We're going to Americanize the immigration thing a little bit. Think about it like this. Immigration is a dynamic topic for the American public. At best, the issue is divided 50-50 among the populace, with at least half of Americans desiring much less to no immigration, all the way to the point to where people don't even want borders at all. All right? So we just had an election, which was kind of a referendum on the Biden administration and how many people they were letting in, right? I mean, illegal immigration was a huge talking point for the Trump administration. And he won largely. He won the Electoral College. He won the popular vote. He won every single swing county, every single swing state. He also won more minorities than like any Republican in history. And so it was a pretty big referendum on the Biden policies. And a lot of that had to do, at least 50% of the levels of people voting were probably doing it exclusively for immigration and the border. All right. So we're going to Americanize this a little bit. What would happen if the southern floodgates were opened and thousands, maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of immigrant Mexicans flooded across the border daily? Daily. How would conservative Christian Americans handle a situation like that? And worse, they weren't being pursued by Border Patrol or law enforcement. Instead, they were permitted to melt into the citizenry, systematically changing the values and language within our beloved republic. We were seeing that a little bit, right? It made people pretty pissed off. Receiving Social Security benefits, full-time entitlements, full disability. People were starting to see that stuff. assumably based on American history, such as the recent Bundy Ranch standoff in Nevada against the Bureau of Land Management, which turned into an armed standoff based on cattle permits. The likelihood of American citizens taking up arms and going to the border themselves is extraordinarily high, especially within our history of self-governance, independence, and cowboy patriotism. This is what happened to the state and people of Palestine, and it happened for 40 years. 4 decades. We dealt with it for 4 years, less than half of a decade, through the Biden administration. And our election was a referendum on those immigration policies. The Palestinian people in Palestine overtly welcomed the Jewish migration in because of the pogroms, with no problem. But it started happening for over 40 years. That's pretty huge. That's a hell of a long time. While World War I raged and the Ottoman Empire continued to allow Jewish immigration into Palestine. On the contrary, as the Ottomans supported Jewish migration into their own state, fundamentally changing their state, but they welcomed them in any way. They understood what was going on. The British, French, Americans, and others covertly pursued avenues to deport their Jewish citizens through Zionism to Palestine to get rid of them. 1922 marked the end of the Ottoman Empire, dismantled by treaty after World War I. But it marked the beginnings of British colonialism in Palestine. This is where things really start to change and get heated and bad. And the origin of the Balfour Declaration, which would forever change the history of the Palestinian and Jewish peoples feeling towards each other. As the world engulfed itself in war, the Zionists and the British behind the scenes were working together to establish an official Jewish state. For anti-colonial purposes, the Ottomans picked the wrong side during the war. World War I, which should have never been fought to begin with, right? I mean, millions and millions of people died because Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, and that didn't need to happen. That was a huge overreaction by the entire world. This resulted in the permanent remapping of the Middle East after their defeat. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration became official British policy, backed by the full weight of the British military. All right. The Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917, statement of the British support for the establishment of Palestine as the establishment of Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. All right. That's what it stated in the Balfour Declaration. The establishment within Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was made in a letter from Arthur James Balfour, a British foreign secretary, to Lionel Walter Rothschild, the second Baron Rothschild, a leader of the Anglo-Jewish community and Zionist. This did not come without intense controversy in the Middle East. This declaration generated extreme distrust and eventually led to the invasion of Israel after its establishment in 1948 by Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Come to find out, the British were making multiple deals at the same time. Okay, this is also extremely important. In 1916, the Hussein-McMahon letters, a series of letters exchanged from 1915 to 1916 during World War I between Hussein Ali, Emir of Mecca, and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. In general terms, the correspondence effectively traded British support of an Arab state for Arab assistance in opposing the Ottoman Empire. This was during World War I, right before the Ottoman Empire had lost in World War I and then was immediately disbanded anyway. But during that time, the Brits were kind of trying to do, this is pretty colonial, right? Like it would go in there and it's Arab to Arab, and they're kind of injecting some disdain between the two sides in there. In a classic move, the British were hedging their bets, making simultaneous deals, understanding that their military and economic prowess protected whichever deal agreement they ultimately felt comfortable with at the end. And after the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, after losing in World War I, the British turned their back on the Hussein Ali in the Independent Arab State Agreement, which was an agreement. The Arab populace never forgot this betrayal. They know about this, and they talk about it, as the Promised Land became twice promised. I'll say that again. The Promised Land became twice promised. It was promised as an Arab state, and now as a Zionist state. All right. In 2016, Avi Shaim wrote The Balfour Declaration and Its Consequences, which goes into extraordinary detail regarding the deep betrayal that took place between Britain and the Middle East, or the Palestinian people. In order to truly recognize this controversy, we must commit ourselves to a deeper understanding of the issue. The violence currently taking place within Israel was birthed through politics, not religion. This is not a religious dispute. This is a political dispute. Before the new Israeli state became official in 1948, the British took control of the Palestinian region and committed egregious violence against the native population, implementing a scorched earth policy as the Arabs desperately attempted to hold on to their land and property. Remember, 40 years of nonstop immigration, and then the Ottoman Empire is disbanded, and then the agreement is scrapped between the British and the Arabs, and now they're about ready to lose their state entirely that they've had for about 2,000 years. Meanwhile, Zionist immigration was hitting new heights, and the young men migrating into Palestine had no desire to melt into the Palestinian population and learn their language and respect their rules and shit. They had no desire for that stuff. They were given arms, and they openly trained for combat with British soldiers in the streets of Jerusalem. Okay, think about it like this. What if a bunch of illegal immigrants came to the United States, were given arms by our government, and then were training on our streets with the United Nations to fight against American citizens? That is what was happening. It'd be like the United Nations showing up to America, bringing in a whole bunch of people from a different population, we could just say Mexico, and then giving them arms and letting them train openly in front of our families for what they're about ready to do. That's what was happening. Okay. In turn, the Arabs mounted a few sporadic rebellions to no success at all. Obviously, they were not trained and they were not well equipped. These rebellions were met with extreme violence, as they were in Tanzania, where the British officially killed the entire Tanzanian population, right? They went to Tanzania and they executed every single Tanzanian in Tanzania until to this day, there isn't a Tanzanian gene left on planet fucking Earth that we know of. They did the same thing in Ireland, Scotland, India. They did a little bit here. All right. Zionist leaders and the British military commandos systematically raped, executed, indefinitely incarcerated, tortured, and killed Palestinians with reckless abandon. And remember, they were welcoming them in because of the pogroms. The villages of Al-Basar in 1938 and Haloun in 1939 experienced atrocities that the human language has a hard time penetrating. We'll go over it a little bit. Right, we'll teach these so-and-sos a lesson. We got all the men in the village, outside where the oil had been burnt and burning. There was a big pool of black oil burnt, and we got all the men by the side of this. And we took one arm and one leg, one man at a time, and flung them all into the middle of the burning oil. They met their first-year little boys from the village school who were just proceeding from school on their way home. A member of the police force, which was the Zionist police force, hurled a bomb at the little boys, which exploded, killing 3 of them, 2 being age 6, 1 being age 7. The Jewish people continued their drive, and when passed near a mosque, one of them fired their rifle, sprayed the rifle into the mosque, killing multiple people. Another Jewish individual fired a shot at a woman carrying her grandchild under 2 years old, killing both of them. More bursts of firing, which were immediately followed by shrills of feminine anguish. I think we can all understand what feminine anguish means. From the direction of a big Arab house. Not long afterwards, 2 or 3 frantic Arab women from the house burst upon us, incoherently explaining that the Jewish people were upon them and had shot or were shooting every single male they could find, regardless of age. This account was written by Matthew Hughes in his essay Terror in Galilee, British and Jewish Collaboration and the Special Night Squads in Palestine during the Arab Revolt of 1938-1939. It was still Palestine. These are their own people in their own country. It wasn't freaking Israel yet. This is 1938 and 1939. This is their own country living in their own country. Much has been recently written about the night squads and the overt violence of the British and Jewish people at this time. The modern world has turned a blind eye to such events, whereas those that inhabit this austere land have not forgotten. While the rest of us could seem to give a shit, it happened to them. They don't forget. If somebody came and murdered your entire family, I think that would be a genetic memory, and they haven't forgotten about it. Once again, let us Americanize this issue again. Here we go. In 1776, the United States declared its independence from Great Britain. Why? Taxation without representation, foreign troops implementing policy through the barrel of a musket, religious freedom, individual freedom primarily, equal protection under the law. Because of this, revolutionaries, as we call them, fought, killed, and died for the freedom of the American Republic. All right. In Palestine, terrorists, as we call them, were systematically eliminated at a rate that would have made the revolutionaries in America's head spin. As a matter of fact, the case study of Tanzania is much more comparable for the Arabs than the American case. I mean, in the American case, we had the Boston Massacre, which was around 10 people got killed, some stuff here and there. Tanzania, they killed every single man, woman, and child of Tanzanian blood systematically. That is way more comparable to the Palestinians than and their fight for independence than what the American citizens went through in the late 18th century on their fight for independence. Got to be honest about it. In Palestine, okay, the case of Tanzania, as I said, is a much better comparative case study. As Daniel Finn wrote in his book, One Man's Terrorist, A Political History of the IRA, or the Irish Republican Army, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The question of who's right and who's wrong is too simple, as the animosity currently perpetrated by both sides eclipses understanding and reason. The Jewish people desired a state, while European Christians pogrom Jews. Modern states covertly sought to deport Jewish people, and the Holocaust woke the world up to the capabilities of inhumanity. The Jewish people believed in their biblical land rights, and they were desperate to escape their own destruction. The Palestinians had lived in the Holy Land since time immemorial. Their traditions, belief structures, tribal values, historic property, and homes grew from ancient Palestinian dirt. This was not a religious war. It is not a religious war, as the Muslims did not hate the Jews. Contrarily, they originally welcomed them into Palestine, and they welcomed them in for decades. Come on in, hang out. All right? But the dirty politics of colonialism turned men from what they wanted to be into what they needed to be. Zionists, conquerors and rulers. Palestinians, rebels and terrorists. Those of us speculating from a distance through Americanize cannot possibly understand the deep political origins of this conflict, of this foreign conflict. Today, Christian Zionism entails quoting the Old Testament and historic Israeli land ownership, while those promoting the two-state solution demand civil rights and humane treatment of the Palestinian people, as the Palestinian people are not Hamas. Like these demonstrations, it's hilarious to me. I see pro-Hamas demonstrations. They're not pro-Hamas demonstrations. I'm not pro-Hamas. I got over 10 combat deployments. I spent time in Israel. I was in a special operations unit. I was a CIA contractor. I was a federal law enforcement officer. It's like, I understand very well what's going on. And I'm just not for the death of tens of thousands of innocent human beings regardless. I've seen a lot of death, seen a lot of destruction, seen a lot of horror. And I got 5 kids. I can't justify it. I just can't. I've tried to, and I can't do it. The theological argument will not prevail, as neither Muslims, Christians, or Jews will compromise in their beliefs, in their religious beliefs. The land ownership argument will not prevail, as neither side will budge on who's been there longer, why, and what that actually means. We're going to fail to find a meaningful solution and somewhat succeed in detailing some very brief history on the matter. Moving forward, we must understand that this is not an American tale, but a Mesopotamian one. All right. Thanks, Adam. Hope you watched the whole damn thing. Love you guys. Have a good one.